Bum 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 bum. The Peter Dislike Show. Bum 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 bum. So this past year, I noticed I've been doing two things correctly. Number one, I've been speaking up for myself, and I realized that I never really had a problem with doing that. There was another hindrance to it. And number two, I find I get less edgy when I'm negotiating. I used to have a bad habit of interrupting people, and I'll get to some examples of those interruptions in a moment. But earlier today, I was negotiating. I teach at Central Arizona College, it's a community college. I was negotiating contracts for the spring, and also I was negotiating with a different school as well. And I found that I was less edgy. I didn't interrupt when I shouldn't. And also, when it was my turn to speak, I actually asked for concessions that I wanted. Now, in the past, I know a lot of you guys on YouTube and also in my general social circle have been chiding me about not speaking up for myself. And I realized it wasn't that I didn't know how to. A lot of times it was because I didn't have room to. I was working at a tutoring center before I started the job here, and I had difficulty with many of my colleagues, and actually not just that tutoring center. Back home in Seattle, Washington, where I spent many years, I had a hard time negotiating with my work there. I worked at two different schools there too, and I would get colleagues who walked all over me. My boss would walk over me. My boss would renege on contracts right in the middle of the semester, and I had a hard time speaking up for that. In large part because that was my livelihood. I didn't have an art project backing me up. I didn't have a whole lot of investments backing me up, and I come to realize this past year it wasn't that I didn't know how to speak for myself. It was I didn't have the tools to do it. And so I'm also a lot less edgy when I hear things that I don't want to hear because I have a lot of backup, right? So, for example, when I was negotiating that contract in the spring, it was one option out of a dozen of them, right? So my boss had said a few things early in the day, and he wasn't sure about the contracts, and I actually didn't interrupt, and I allowed him to speak. And I have a hard time doing that. Um, 10 years ago, I was still living with my parents. My mom and I have this bad habit of interrupting each other. I used to be, obviously, at the age that I was at, I was always uh, being dependent on living with my family, always put me on edge, right? And so I would hear things that I don't want to hear. I would interrupt. My parents had a bad habit of interrupting me too because they were worried about the direction in life I was taking. Now, my mom has this bad habit. She likes to interrupt. And sometimes stories have flow to them, right? If I had intended to say A, B, C, D, E, and I get to A, B, C, and she interrupts, by the time I get back to my story, I kind of have to start with A again, right? Sometimes the flow, depending on what the issue was on hand, sometimes you don't just cut into a story. And then she would get very impatient. She was like, she would say, I've heard this a dozen times already. Well, yeah, you need to stop and let me finish the story. There's a flow to it. And oftentimes I would have a hard time with that. And where it became a big problem was that sometimes there was a very good explanation for something that she was unhappy about. If only she let me finish the story, right? And it created a lot of tension. Nowadays, now that I have multiple solid paths, I tend not to get edgy. If you don't want to listen to it, great. I got 10 other things that I got to do, right? And so that was good. Unfortunately, the art projects have created its own set of hazards as well, right? And so I need to find some kind of way. I love that the art projects have given me so much power to wield on these situations, but I hate that they come with a huge opportunity cost. There has to be an in between solution. That's what my goal for the rest of the year is going to be to find, pray. And I hope you will pray for me by leaving a dislike on this video. This is the Peter Dislike Show. Bum, 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 bum. The Peter Dislike Show. Bum, 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 bum. Bum, 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 bum. The Peter Dislike Show. Bum, 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 bum.